Welcome back to The Heat. We turn now to another economic story that has significance for China and the United States. The US is leading an effort to form a trade deal with 11 other Pacific Rim nations. The Trans-Pacific Partnership is still a work in progress, but if concluded, it would be the biggest ever trade agreement for the Asia-Pacific region. China is not part of the 12-nation group at the moment. Joining me now to discuss it is Dan Ikenson. He's the director of the Cato Institute's Stiefel Center for Trade Policy Studies, and he's an expert on US-China trade. He also favours TPP trade deal. Also with me is Dean Baker. He's the co-director of the Centre for Economic and Policy Research, and he's opposed to the deal. And still with us is Victor Gao, the director of the China National Association of International Studies, and he joins us from Reykjavik. Welcome all to the show. Dan, I want to start with you. TPP is a huge project. It's been negotiated over several years and widened. What are the chances of its success now that the US Congress has basically said go ahead and negotiate US President Obama? And what is it going to look like if it's signed?
Yeah, I think its chances of success are far greater now that Trade Promotion Authority was granted last month. That was identified by trade ministers around in the other countries as the biggest impediment to concluding the TPP. We will see, though. There's a ministerial meeting scheduled for the end of this month at which some people think agreement will be reached. I think it's going to take a bit longer than that. There are a lot of issues that...
What are the main hurdles?
Well, there's a tobacco carve-out, for example, that was raised several years ago, and I'm not sure that it has been resolved. I'm not aware that any agreement has been reached as to how to deal with that. Government procurement issues, intellectual property issues, and of course the linchpin issues are market access, Japanese access to the Japanese market, the Canadian market, the US market for various agricultural products. The end game of these negotiations often takes a lot longer than projected, and so it's quite possible that an agreement won't be reached until the end of the year or even into the next year, which puts its implementation during this administration into doubt.
Trade deals are being trumpeted by the US president and his Republican rivals in Congress. But we're in a presidential campaign season here, Dean, and it's not necessarily popular across the board, this trade deal at all, is it?
It's overwhelmingly unpopular, which is why, you know, there's a joke that you pass trade deals in odd number of years we don't have elections. and the story we had, we did get the fast-tracked authority, and that is generally considered the biggest obstacle. We did get that approved already. But on the other hand, we're not going to have a completed deal for Congress to vote on until at very soonest at the end of this year and quite likely into next year, which means this is the height of the presidential campaign season. People may not realize this, but we're going to have our primaries. This is going to be a very big issue in both the Democratic and Republican primaries, and you'll have a lot of people there strongly opposed to the deal.
Why are you so strongly opposed to it?
Well, I see it not really about trade. This is primarily about a regulatory structure which is very much pro-business, and I think in many ways very, very bad. And the place I'll highlight is on intellectual property. It makes stronger and longer patent and copyright protection. Big issue here, prescription drugs. The United States spends over 2% of its GDP, $400 billion a year on prescription drugs. These would cost on the order of $30 billion if we had a free market. Patents are an incredibly inefficient, distortionary way to finance drug research. So rather than trying to impose this on the rest of the world, I would rather see the United States adopt a more modern system.
So it's great if you're Pfizer or someone like that, but not necessarily if you're trying to compete with Pfizer in other countries.
Exactly.
What's always, I scratch my head because the biggest economic relationship in the world is between the US and China. Victor Gao, I want to bring you in here, but China is not part of the TPP. It's considered in some parts to be excluding China on purpose, set up in a way to exclude it. What's your view?
Well, first of all, China is the largest trading nation in the world, and China is the largest economy or the second largest economy, depending on whether you use PPP or nominal exchange rate as the benchmark. But anyway, from the Chinese perspective, we always welcome genuine steps and initiatives to promote true free trade in the world. Therefore, if TPP is a genuine attempt at promoting free trade, China welcomes that. And eventually, who knows, China may become a member of TPP upon invitation by the organization, of course. On the other hand, if TPP sounds like free trade on the surface, but has some kind of ideological twist to it, which aims at preventing China from joining TPP eventually, then I don't think TPP eventually will work as satisfactorily as its designers want to, mainly because any trade bloc without having China as a member may eventually be weak fundamentally. Therefore, I would say if TPP really takes off, hopefully China will become a member soon. If TPP does not take off, China is very happy to work with members who want to join TPP already, Australia, South Korea, for example, Singapore, which are already working with the United States and Japan to formalize all the work for this TPP. China is happy to work with TPP eventually, but also is happy to work with all the members which may have already signed free trade agreement with China.
Dan, you know, a lot of people say that the TPP is the third leg of the stool in the pivot to Asia of the Obama administration, the economic leg. Why isn't China involved? And can you see them? There has been a much more moderate talk on both sides about China eventually joining. Can you see that as well?
Yeah. No, I mean, this interest in the United States in this deal originated in the State Department, and it was part of the process of extricating ourselves from
New Zealand, Singapore.
Well, there was the P4 originally, New Zealand and Singapore and Chile and Brunei, who were negotiating this. The United States, after the last failure of an attempt to conclude the Doha round in 2008, expressed interest in the P4. But it wasn't until the Obama administration, and really Hillary Clinton as the Secretary of State, that there was interest in showing the world that we're back and that we are interested in this area. And that narrative involved, to a certain extent, isolating China, checking China's rise. But many of us reacted to that in a way that said, you know, this doesn't make any economic sense if it excludes China. And ultimately, I think the Chinese want to get in. The United States would be pleased with that outcome as well. But it might not just be the TPP. The TPP will accept new members at some point. But I think the broader goal is a free trade area of the Asia-Pacific.
That's right, and China's pushing something called the RCEP, which has ASEAN members in it, and this alphabet soup may combine at some later stage. But let's go back to the opposition, Dean, because you talked about patents earlier, but a lot of opponents to TPP, especially here in the United States, but also potentially in Asia and Latin America, see it as a jobs killer too.
Well, I have to say I don't see very much there. I mean, we've had trade deals that I think did have a large impact on our labor markets. I'd look back to NAFTA, our deal with Mexico, and that was really about making it easy for manufacturing companies to relocate to Mexico and to ship back their goods to the United States. There will be some of that here. I mean, particularly you look at a country like Malaysia, Vietnam, it will reduce barriers, make it somewhat easier to do that. But given that you already have low-cost labor available right at our border, it's hard to see how much you gain by going halfway across the world, you know. So I have a hard time seeing an immediate jobs impact.
What are the other obstacles for you in terms of this deal?
Well, one of the things I was mentioning, regulatory structures, this sets up this investor-state dispute settlement mechanism, which
That's been very controversial in Europe, actually, as well, for the transatlantic.
And it's an extrajudicial tribunal that would have jurisdiction over state, local, federal laws. And it's very peculiar. I mean, the argument is that foreign investors need assurances that they'll be treated fairly. And you can make arguments. I'm not going to pass judgment on other countries' court systems, but I think it's hard to make the case that in the U.S. that foreign investors can't count on being treated fairly. So you sort of left going, why do we need this?
Yeah, special court set up for corporations, someone told me in Europe as well. Victor Gao, when you look at sort of intellectual property talk in this TPP and labour standards, do you feel somehow it was written earlier on to maybe exclude the Chinese economy that we saw perhaps a decade ago but is rapidly changing?
Well, first of all, on the intellectual property rights, China now is very much advocating for protection of the legitimate intellectual property rights. Part of the reason is now China is emerging very much as an owner of intellectual property rights. China has new patents, applications, for example, than any other country in the world. So it is not only the right thing to do for China to do this, but also it is in China's own interest to grant full protection to intellectual property rights. Whether there are still problems in implementation, yes, of course there are problems, but the overall direction is for China to really rise up to the task of becoming a full protector of intellectual property rights. From the Chinese perspective, there are two issues with TPP. One is the so-called negative list. That is, if you agree with the TPP, so long as there is a negative list, if anything, investment, trade, etc., services are not on the negative list, then all the member states should have free access to each other's market. That's number one. In China, we have already set up free trade zones in Shanghai, in Guangdong, in Tianjin autonomous, municipality, and the one focus is to really restructure the economic activities based on the negative list. That's one thing that China needs to move up the ladder very quickly. The other thing is about the labor rights. Now, in the TPP draft, I understand there is a higher hurdle encouraging the establishment of trade union companies which engage in economic activities. In China, we also have trade union for all the companies that we run businesses in China, but the trade union is not designed to be a confrontational vehicle against either the capital provider or the company management or the government regulators. It actually is designed to encourage consultation. So I think on these two areas, China needs to readjust itself very quickly to
Victor,
what will be the final requirements of the TPP.
Victor, thank you. I just want to go to Dean. If this is signed, this deal, and Dan, sorry, Dan first, what are the implications for GDP growth across the world? We're seeing flat Europe, we're seeing flat Asia in some parts. We saw 7% growth in China, same as before.
Well, there have been a lot of projections put out by economists, and I'm always skeptical of those projections because we don't know what exactly is in the TPP. We don't know its terms, but trade enables specialization, and when we can specialize, we can produce more. We can produce more, and more importantly, we can consume more. So it creates wealth and opportunity. So clearly, it will have a positive impact on global GDP. How much? I'm not too sure. I also want to just note that some of the reservations that Dean expressed, I share. The ISDS, some IP reservations. I'm for free trade. This is a managed trade agreement. We've got to make sure that the perfect is not made the enemy of the good, though. So we're going to evaluate each chapter and decide whether or not this is trade liberalizing as opposed to more protectionist.
And Dean, you have some problems with it. Would you like to see China involved in the end?
Well, I'm not sure this is the right process. Obviously, U.S. trades a lot with China, will continue to trade more, through time, which I think on the whole is a very good thing. But whether this is the right vehicle, I think that remains to be seen.
Dean Baker here and Dan as well. Thank you so much. Victor Gao in Reykjavik as well. That's all we have time for. We'd love to hear from you, so please send us your questions, comments and story ideas to theheat@cctv-america.com. And we'd like to continue the conversation online on social media. Give us your thoughts and comments on our Facebook page at CCTV America. I'm Nathan King in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.